somewhere in a frozen forest, in the winter of 1939, a country of 3.5 million people looked across a snow-covered border at the largest army on Earth and decided not to move. That line is not a metaphor. It is not a dramatization. It is the literal, documented, historical truth of what happened on the 30th of November, 1939, when Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border along a front stretching from the Gulf of Finland to the Arctic Ocean. The Red Army that crossed that border had more tanks than the rest of Europe combined. It had nearly 4,000 aircraft against Finland's 114. It had a population base of roughly 170 million people against Finland's 3.5 million. By every measurable calculation of military power, men, machines, artillery, aircraft, industrial production, geographic depth, this contest should have lasted 2 weeks at most. Soviet military planners had said as much openly and had organized their logistics accordingly. Finnish boots would be hearing Russian marching songs in Helsinki before Christmas. They were wrong, not just slightly wrong. Not wrong in the way that optimistic military planning is usually wrong, where things take twice as long and cost twice as much as expected. They were wrong in a way that exposed the entire architecture of how the Soviet military thought about itself, about its opponents, and about the relationship between political confidence and military competence. The Winter War lasted 105 days. It destroyed multiple Soviet divisions in the forests of central Finland. It humiliated the Red Army in front of the entire watching world at the exact moment when the world most needed to understand what the Soviet Union was capable of. And it ended not with Finland's conquest, but with a negotiated peace that left Finland damaged, diminished, and intact. Still there, still itself. I've been thinking about this war for a long time, and I want to tell you up front why it keeps pulling me back. Because I think the reason matters for how you watch what follows. The Winter War is not a comfortable story. It doesn't resolve cleanly. There's no moment at the end where the right side wins, and the credits roll over a landscape of relief and celebration. What there is, instead, is something more interesting and more true to how history actually works. A small country doing something extraordinary, paying an enormous price for it, and arriving at an outcome that was neither victory nor defeat, but something in between that required wisdom to accept and courage to survive. That's not the story we usually get told about war. It's the story this war actually is. This is a documentary about Finland, but it's also a documentary about what happens when political confidence outstrips military preparation. It's about what the purge of an officer corps actually looks like when the purged army is sent into the field. It's about a peace negotiation that failed and then another one that succeeded, and the specific, precise cost of the gap between them. It's about 400,000 people who left their homes in a February evacuation and never came back. It's about what the word sisu actually means when you translate it not from the Finnish dictionary, but from the Finnish experience. The quality that keeps a man in a frozen trench, ammunition running low, temperature at -30, knowing that the force across the border is 10 times the size of his own, and staying anyway. Let me give you the geography, because the geography is everything in this story. Finland in 1939 shared its entire eastern border with the Soviet Union, a border that stretched roughly 1,300 kilometers from the Gulf of Finland in the south to the Arctic Ocean in the north. The Karelian Isthmus, that narrow corridor of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga, was the most strategically sensitive point on the entire frontier. Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city, its great northern port, the city that Stalin, above almost all others, was unwilling to see threatened, sat just 32 kilometers from that border. The Soviet argument for border adjustments wasn't invented purely for propaganda purposes. The proximity of the Finnish frontier to Leningrad was a genuine strategic vulnerability in the event of a European war. What was invented or constructed, or at minimum wildly exaggerated, was the claim that Finland posed a threat serious enough to justify what Moscow actually demanded. That's that distinction between the real strategic concern and the manufactured justification for what the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had already allocated is one of the central questions of the war's origins. We're going to spend real time with it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that document signed on the 23rd of August 1939 between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, is where this story begins in earnest, though its roots go back much further. The public face of the pact was a non-aggression agreement between two systems that had spent the previous decade defining themselves as existential opposites. The secret face was a map of Eastern Europe, divided between two empires, drawn by two men in Moscow, without the knowledge or consent of any of the countries it affected. Under that secret protocol, Finland was placed inside the Soviet sphere of influence. Not consulted, not warned, allocated. Like a chess piece moved by a hand it never saw. Within weeks, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been pressured into signing agreements, allowing Soviet military bases on their soil. Within months, they would cease to exist as independent states. Finland watched all of this happening and made a decision that is either the most courageous act of national self-determination in 20th century European history, or the most costly miscalculation of the negotiating table, or both, depending on which week of the war you're asking about and which historian you're reading. There's a figure at the center of this story who I want you to hold in your mind from the very beginning, because as understanding him is essential for understanding everything that follows. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim was 72 years old when the Winter War began. He was Finnish by identity, Swedish-speaking by birth, Russian imperial by military training, and a lifetime of professional service. He had served the Tsar across two continents. He had led the Finnish Whites in the brutal civil war of 1918. He had spent 2 decades in a complicated semi-retirement, writing and traveling and chairing the Finnish Defense Council and warning, repeatedly, that Finland needed to spend more money preparing for a war he could see was coming. By 1939, he had been right about the threat for years. He had been largely ignored about the preparation, and now he was being handed command of a defense that he had, just weeks earlier, told the Finnish government it should have avoided by accepting a negotiated compromise. He took the command anyway. He executed it with a precision and cold strategic clarity that military historians still study, and he wrote about it afterwards with an honesty that is, in my experience of reading military memoirs, genuinely unusual. Mannerheim is not a simple hero. He is something more interesting. A man whose complexity is inseparable from his achievement. On the other side of the border, there is a story of institutional failure so complete that it reshaped the Second World War. Joseph Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 had reached into the Red Army's officer corps with a thoroughness that is almost impossible to process. 3 of the Army's 5 marshals were shot. 13 of 15 Army commanders were shot or imprisoned. 50 of 57 corps commanders were removed. More than 200 of the Army's division and brigade commanders were purged. The men who replaced them were younger, less experienced, and, in many cases, more politically reliable than professionally competent. The dual command system that placed political commissars beside every tactical commander with authority to countermand operational orders created a paralysis of independent thinking at exactly the level where independent thinking is most required. This was the army that crossed into Finland in November of 1939. The Winter War would expose every one of these failures, publicly over 105 days while the world watched. There is one more thing I need to tell you before we begin, and it's about the cold. Not the metaphorical cold of isolation or political abandonment, though there was plenty of that too. The actual cold. The winter of 1939 and 1940 was one of the coldest in the recorded meteorological history of the region. In the forests of central Finland, around the areas where the most dramatic battles took place, temperatures dropped to minus 43 degrees Celsius. That is a temperature at which exposed skin develops frostbite in under 2 minutes, at which diesel fuel congeals, at which rifle lubricant turns to paste and weapons jam, at which a man who stops moving in the wrong place and falls asleep does not wake up. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had been told they were going on a 2-week campaign and had been issued equipment accordingly, were fighting and dying and freezing in conditions that their command structure had told them they would not face. Finnish soldiers who had grown up in this landscape and trained in these conditions, who knew how to move through deep snow on skis at night without being seen and without getting lost, who understood how to use every frozen lake and every dense forest stand as a tactical asset. These were the men that the Red Army's logistics officers had calculated would be neutralized within a fortnight. The gap between that calculation and what actually happened is the story we're about to tell. 15 chapters, 105 days of war, 80 years of consequence. This is the complete history of the Winter War, Finland against the Soviet Union. If you've read this far, if you're the kind of person who wants the real story, the full story, told with the precision it deserves and the patience the subject demands, then this series was made for you. Hit subscribe right now, because every chapter of this documentary is built the same way, from primary sources, from the actual historical record, from the specific details that prove a human being with genuine curiosity organized this material rather than an algorithm generating plausible-sounding history. There are no shortcuts here. There is no filler. There is just the story, as accurately as it can be told. Leave a comment below telling me which part of the Winter War you've always wanted to understand better. The Motti battles, the failed negotiations, the Mannerheim Line's final days, the human cost of the evacuation. I read every comment. The ones that ask the best questions shape what goes deeper in each chapter. This is a conversation about history, not a lecture about it. And that distinction matters to me. And if you know someone who has never heard of the Winter War, someone who knows the Second World War through Normandy and Stalingrad and the Pacific, but has never encountered this particular story from this particular corner of the conflict, share this with them. The Winter War deserves to be known. The people who fought it deserve to be remembered. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Long Road to Independence. Finland before the war. There's a temptation when you begin a story like this to start with the first shots, to open on the morning of the 30th of November 1939, when Soviet bombers appeared over Helsinki and the city's air raid sirens rang out for the first time. But if you start there, you miss everything that made that morning possible, and everything that made the Finnish response to it so remarkable. To understand the Winter War, you have to go back much further. You have to go back to a country that didn't exist yet. For centuries, Finland was not a nation in any formal sense. It was the eastern edge of the Swedish Empire, a territory of forests and farms and Lutheran parishes, stretching from the Baltic coast up into the subarctic. Swedish was the language of administration, of the educated class, of the courts and the church. Finnish was spoken by the peasantry, by the woodsmen and the fishermen, the people who actually worked the land. The country existed as a kind of cultural borderland, neither fully Swedish nor yet its own thing, and that ambiguity would define its politics for generations to come. Then, in 1909, during the Napoleonic Wars, everything changed. Russia defeated Sweden in a short conflict and absorbed Finland as an autonomous Grand Duchy. It was a peculiar arrangement by the standards of imperial conquest. The Tsar of Russia became the Grand Duke of Finland, but Finland kept its own senate, its own laws, its own Lutheran church. Wide autonomy was the deal. For most of the 19th century, Finland operated almost like a state within a state. Different currency, different judicial system, different administrative structure. St. Petersburg was the capital of the empire, but Helsinki ran its own affairs. That arrangement held, more or less, until the 1890s, when Russian imperial policy shifted towards something historians call Russification. The goal was to bind the empire's frontier territories more tightly to the Russian core, to impose Russian as the language of administration, to bring Finnish military service under Russian command, to integrate Finnish institutions into the imperial bureaucracy. From St. Petersburg's perspective, this was rational centralization. From Finland's perspective, it was the beginning of an existential argument about what Finnish identity even meant. I find something genuinely clarifying in this period. The way Russification inadvertently created the Finnish national consciousness it was trying to suppress. Before the pressure began, the question of what it meant to be Finnish was mainly cultural and linguistic. Russification made it political. It turned a cultural identity into a political demand. Poets and intellectuals, who had been writing folk songs and mythological epics, suddenly found themselves being read as political resistors. The Kalevala, Finland's national epic, went from being a literary curiosity to being almost a manifesto. Not because anyone intended it that way, but because that's what happens when you tell a people that their language and traditions are incompatible with the state they live in. The First World War broke the Russian Empire apart. The Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik seizure of power, the chaos of civil war in Russia, all of it created a window. On the 6th of December, 1917, the Finnish Senate declared independence. The new Bolshevik government, led by Vladimir Lenin, recognized the new Finnish state just 3 weeks later. One of the few acts of recognition the Bolsheviks would grant to a national independence movement, and driven more by ideological principle and practical exhaustion than by any warmth toward Finland. But independence didn't mean peace. Almost immediately, Finland descended into its own civil war, the Reds, broadly backed by Finnish workers and aligned with socialist ideas, against the Whites, broadly representing the conservative landowning and bourgeois class. German-trained Finnish soldiers, the Jaegers, returned from the Western Front. German troops actually landed in Finland to support the Whites. The Civil War lasted only a few months, but it was brutal and it left scars that didn't heal quickly. Nearly 40,000 people died, not just in battle, but in the prison camps that followed, where hunger and disease killed thousands who had already surrendered. By 1920, the war was over and the borders were drawn. Finland signed the Treaty of Tartu with Soviet Russia, which confirmed the old border between the autonomous Grand Duchy and Imperial Russia proper as the new frontier. Finland also received Petsamo, a strip of territory that gave it access to the Arctic Ocean, a port that wouldn't freeze in winter, which is strategically important in a way that is easy to underestimate. The Bolsheviks got their recognition, the Finns got their border, and for a moment in the early 1920s, it looked as though the arrangement might hold. It didn't, of course, but the 20 years between the Treaty of Tartu and the Winter War are important precisely because they aren't simply a steady march toward inevitable conflict. There were non-aggression pacts. Finland and the Soviet Union signed one in 1932 and renewed it in 1934. There were moments of genuine diplomatic normalcy, and there was Finland's own internal argument. about what kind of country it wanted to be. A small democracy trying to navigate between the rising pressure of Nazi Germany to the west and the Soviet Union to the east, while simultaneously arguing about whether Swedish or Finnish should be the dominant language, whether communism should be illegal, and how to build an economy largely dependent on timber and exports. What I want you to hold in your mind as we move through the next chapters is this. Finland in the late 1930s was a young country. It had been independent for barely 2 decades. Its democratic institutions were new. Its military was chronically underfunded and lacked modern equipment in almost every category. And yet it possessed something that is very difficult to measure on a military balance sheet: a genuinely broad national consensus that its independence was worth defending at almost any cost. That consensus, that thing Finnish historians call the talvisodan henki. The spirit of the Winter War didn't emerge from nowhere. It was built over 20 years of learning, painfully, what it meant to be Finland. Chapter 2. The Shadow Falls. Europe in 1939-1939 is one of those years that historians return to compulsively, because it is one of the few years in modern history where you can actually watch the international order collapse in near real time. It begins with Europe tense, but technically at peace. It ends with the continent at war, Poland erased from the map, and the Soviet Union bombarding a small Nordic democracy that most of the world couldn't have found on a map 6 months earlier. The speed of the deterioration is almost vertiginous. I want to situate Finland carefully within this larger collapse, because the Winter War is almost always taught in isolation. As a remarkable military story about Finnish ski troops and Soviet failures, without being placed inside the broader European crisis that made it possible. The Winter War didn't happen because Stalin suddenly decided to covet Finnish forests. It happened because the geopolitical architecture of Europe had been fundamentally reordered by a single document signed in Moscow in August of 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and his German counterpart Joachim von Ribbentrop, was publicly presented as a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The two great ideological enemies of the age, the two systems that had been defining themselves against each other for over a decade, had decided to stop threatening each other and cooperate instead. The public face of the pact was already alarming enough. The secret protocol attached to it was the document that mattered most. In that secret protocol, Eastern Europe was divided into spheres of influence. Germany got Western Poland, Lithuania was eventually transferred, and the Soviet Union received Eastern Poland, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. This was not metaphorical. The protocol, signed by 2 men in Moscow, placed Finland inside the Soviet sphere of influence in the same way that you draw a line on a map with a pencil. No Finnish politician, no Finnish citizen, no Finnish soldier had any say in it. They were allocated. That fact, that Finland's fate was quietly traded away in Moscow without any Finnish knowledge, is one of the colder details in the whole story. The sequence of events that followed moved with the kind of grim logic that only becomes fully visible in retrospect. Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. The Soviet Union invaded Eastern Poland on the 17th of September, dividing the country between the two powers. In October, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were each pressured into signing agreements allowing Soviet military bases on their soil. They complied, one after another, correctly calculating that resistance was impossible. I've thought a lot about why Finland reacted differently to the Soviet pressure that was coming. It's a question that has occupied Finnish historians for decades, and there isn't a single clean answer. Part of it was geography. Finland's terrain made a rapid Soviet conquest far less certain than it had been in the Baltic states, which are relatively flat and exposed. Part of it was domestic politics. Finland's democratic government, however nervous, was not willing to sign agreements that could compromise Finnish sovereignty without a fight in parliament. And part of it, I think, was simpler than that. Finland had fought for its independence less than a generation ago. The memory of what it cost was not abstract. Finland declared itself neutral at the start of the war. It was a declaration that the Soviet Union, with its secret protocol in a drawer, was not inclined to honor. In Moscow, the planning had already begun. The Leningrad military district commander, Kirill Meretskov, was ordered to draft an invasion plan as early as July of 1939, months before the pact was even signed. The timetable was drawn up with a characteristic Soviet confidence. The Finnish campaign would take 2 weeks at most. Soviet soldiers were reportedly warned not to cross the border mistakenly into Sweden. The Soviet calculation deserves some attention here, because it wasn't simply arrogance, or rather, it wasn't only arrogance. There was a genuine strategic concern at its core. Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second city, and its great northern port, sat only 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. In the event of a European war, which was now a fact, the Soviets genuinely feared that a hostile power could use Finnish territory as a staging ground for operations against Leningrad. Whether that fear was sincere or constructed to justify territorial ambitions is a debate that Russian historians still haven't fully resolved. Probably both were true in different proportions, but the internal Soviet logic had another dimension that doesn't get discussed enough, and I think it's crucial for understanding what was about to happen. Stalin's Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 had devastated the Red Army's officer corps. About 11,000 officers were repressed, fired, imprisoned, or executed. Among those purged were 3 of the Army's 5 marshals, and 220 of its 264 division-level commanders or higher. The officers who replaced them were often less competent, but more politically loyal. The dual command system, where unit commanders required approval from political commissars for major decisions, further paralyzed independent tactical thinking. What this produced was an army of extraordinary size and technical resource that had been methodically stripped of its most experienced leadership. The Red Army that would cross into Finland in November of 1939 was a military instrument with an enormous handle and a broken blade. Stalin didn't know that. The evidence suggests he genuinely believed the purge had made the army more reliable by removing potential traitors. The Finnish campaign would teach him otherwise at enormous cost to the Soviet army, to the Finnish people, and ultimately to the very different kind of army the Soviets would need to face Germany less than 2 years later. Meanwhile, Finland was doing what small democracies under pressure often do. It was negotiating, stalling, hoping for a different outcome, and quietly mobilizing at the same time. In September and October of 1939, the Finnish government called up reservists under the pretext of additional refresher training. The border fortifications on the Karelian Isthmus, the defensive structure that would come to be called the Mannerheim Line, were being strengthened by university students and volunteers working long shifts through the late summer. Finland was trying to buy time. The question was whether it was buying enough. Chapter 3, The Negotiations, Helsinki and Moscow, Autumn 1939. On the 5th of October 1939, the Soviet government invited Finland to send a delegation to Moscow for concrete political discussions. The phrasing was diplomatic, which is to say it was deliberately vague about what exactly was being demanded. The Finnish government, fully aware that Estonia had just signed away the right to host Soviet military bases on its soil, sent its ambassador in Stockholm Juho Kusti Paasikivi, rather than the foreign minister himself. The reasoning was precise and revealing. By sending someone with limited powers to negotiate, the government was signaling that any agreement would require extensive consultation back home. It was a delaying tactic dressed up as protocol. The meetings began in Moscow on the 12th of October, and here is something that surprised me when I first read the accounts. Stalin himself attended. He personally participated in 6 of the 7 negotiating sessions. This was unusual. Soviet dictators didn't generally sit across a table from minor power delegations and work through border adjustments in detail. Stalin's presence signaled something. Either that he was genuinely trying to reach an agreement he considered reasonable, or that he wanted to personally ensure no face-saving compromise slipped through. Historians disagree about which it was. Probably it was both, at different moments. The Soviet demands, as laid out by Foreign Minister Molotov, were specific and territorial. The Finns would be required to move the border on the Karelian Isthmus, roughly 25 to 30 kilometers westward, closer to Viipuri, Finland's second largest city. All existing Finnish fortifications on the isthmus would be demolished. Finland would cede several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and Finland would lease the Hanko Peninsula, a stretch of coastline at the southwestern tip of the country, to the Soviet Union for 30 years, allowing the construction of a Soviet naval base. In exchange, the Soviet offered to cede a larger piece of territory from eastern Karelia, about 2,000 square miles, in exchange for roughly 1,000. On paper, in purely mathematical terms, Finland was being offered more land than it was being asked to surrender. Paasikivi understood this. Mannerheim, Finland's most experienced military commander, understood this. Väinö Tanner, the social democratic leader who would later join the negotiating team, understood this. All 3 of them, in various ways and at various times, counseled the Finnish government that some territorial compromise was better than war. Mannerheim was particularly direct. He was pessimistic about Finland's chances in any sustained conflict, and said so without softening it. But the Finnish government, and specifically Foreign Minister Elias Erkko, saw the situation differently. Erkko and others believed, not entirely without reason, that the Soviet demands were a negotiating opening rather than a final position. They also feared, with considerable historical justification, that accepting any Soviet military presence on Finnish soil was a first step toward the kind of Sovietization that had just consumed the Baltic states. There was also a domestic political dimension. A 5/6 parliamentary majority would be needed to approve any territorial cession, and the political will wasn't there. When Stalin reportedly mocked this requirement, proposing that he and Molotov could simply add their votes, the exchange captured, in miniature, the fundamental incomprehension between the 2 sides. The negotiations went through several rounds. Stalin, to his credit, actually reduced his demands at one point. He lowered the requested Hanko garrison from 5,000 men to 4,000. He shortened the proposed lease term. He reduced the area of Karelian Isthmus land demanded. These reductions were real, but they also confused the Finnish side, because they seemed to suggest the Soviets' original demands hadn't been minimalist after all, which meant further concessions might be extractable with patience. The 2 sides were, in a very real sense, operating in different negotiating frameworks and didn't fully realize it. The Finns made 2 counteroffers, both falling far short of what Moscow wanted. The final session took place on the 9th of November. Paasikivi announced Finland's refusal to accept even the reduced demands. Stalin and Molotov were visibly surprised. Tanner later wrote, in one of those moments of detail that genuine primary sources provide, that the eyes of our opposite numbers opened wide. Stalin asked simply, "You don't even offer Eno?" referring to a Finnish fort that had been part of earlier, informal Finnish concessions. Paasikivi said no. The session ended. No Soviet officials came to the train station to see the Finnish delegation off. Looking at these negotiations now, with the knowledge of what followed, it's almost unbearable to read. Not because the outcome was inevitable, I don't think it was, but because both sides were, in their own ways, making rational calculations that were based on flawed understandings of the other. The Finns thought Stalin was bluffing, or at least that his demands were flexible in ways that could be negotiated down to something tolerable. Stalin thought the Finns would eventually do what the Baltic states had done. Both sides were wrong about the most important thing they needed to know about the other. The Soviets stopped responding to Finnish diplomatic communications after the delegation left Moscow. Then, on the 26th of November, came the Mainila incident. A Soviet border post near the village of Mainila on the Russian side of the frontier was reportedly shelled by Finnish artillery. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov claimed 4 soldiers were killed and 9 injured. He demanded an apology and the withdrawal of Finnish forces from the border zone. The Finns denied any responsibility, accurately as it turned out. Later research by Finnish and Russian historians concluded that the shelling was a staged provocation carried out from the Soviet side of the border by NKVD units, designed to provide a casus belli for what had already been decided. Soviet war games conducted in March of both 1938 and 1939 had used an identical scenario as their starting point. Border incidents at Mainila sparking a conflict with Finland. The provocation was not improvised. It was planned, rehearsed, and executed on schedule. Finland rejected the Soviet demands. The Soviet Union announced it was withdrawing from the Non-Aggression Pact. Diplomatic relations were severed on the 28th of November. 2 days later, at 0800 hours, the Leningrad front received the order to cross the Finnish border. There is a piece of music that haunts this chapter of the story. Stalin's Leningrad party boss, Andrei Zhdanov, had commissioned a celebratory piece from the composer Dmitri Shostakovich. The suite on Finnish themes, intended to be performed by Red Army marching bands as they paraded through Helsinki after the expected rapid Soviet victory. The suite was written. The parade never happened. Shostakovich filed the completed work away, and it would sit in an archive for decades before anyone thought about it again. History has a way of turning its grand gestures into inadvertent monuments to miscalculation. Chapter 4. The Mannerheim Line. Finland's shield and its limits, Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, is one of the strangest figures in 20th century European history. And I mean that as genuine intellectual respect rather than a backhanded compliment. He was a Finnish marshal who had been born into the Swedish-speaking Finnish aristocracy, had been trained in the Imperial Russian military, had served the Tsar for decades, and risen to the rank of general, had led the Finnish White Forces in the Civil War of 1918, and then spent the 1920s and 30s in a complicated semi-retirement, travelling, writing, chairing the Finnish Defence Council, while arguing, mostly unsuccessfully, that Finland needed to spend more money on its defences. Mannerheim understood the terrain of the Karelian Isthmus, the way a man understands a country he has spent a lifetime studying from both sides of its border. The Isthmus, that narrow neck of land connecting Finland to Russia, bounded by the Gulf of Finland to the west and Lake Ladoga to the east, was the obvious invasion route. It was roughly 120 kilometers wide at its broadest, narrowing considerably further south. Any large Soviet force coming from the direction of Leningrad would be funneled through this corridor, and whoever had prepared that corridor for defense had a significant advantage over whoever was trying to move through it. The defensive structure that became known as the Mannerheim Line was named after the marshal. though Mannerheim himself was somewhat ambivalent about the name. He reportedly considered it an exaggeration of what the fortifications actually were. And here, the historiographical debate becomes genuinely interesting because the Mannerheim Line has been mythologized in very directions by very different parties. Soviet propaganda in the aftermath of the war described it as an impregnable modern fortress comparable to the French Maginot Line, partly to excuse the Red Army's initial failures. Western journalists, amazed by Finnish resistance, wrote of concrete bunkers and steel turrets on a scale that the actual construction simply didn't support. The truth, as usual, is more mundane and in some ways more impressive than the myth. The Mannerheim Line was, for the most part, not a line of concrete fortresses. The vast majority of it was trenches, earthworks, and field fortifications, built by incorporating the natural terrain, using fallen trees, boulders, and the landscape itself as defensive obstacles. There were some concrete bunkers, but they were mostly small, few in number, and thinly spread. The line had hardly any integrated artillery. What it had, in abundance, was something that doesn't photograph well and doesn't make for exciting journalism. It had been built by people who understood exactly what the terrain looked like and exactly how an attacking force would try to move through it. The defensive philosophy reflected a broader Finnish military approach that had been developing through the 1930s. Finland's defense budget was, by any European standard, modest. The country couldn't build a Maginot Line even if it had wanted to. It simply didn't have the money. What it could do was train its reservists to fight in the specific conditions of Finnish winter and Finnish forest, and build a defensive position that used the landscape as its primary obstacle. Finnish soldiers trained in cross-country skiing. They knew how to move through deep snow quietly and quickly. They knew how to navigate in near total darkness. These weren't exotic special forces skills in Finland. They were the basic competencies of men who had grown up in that environment. The Finnish mobilization that autumn was also more complete than the Soviets appreciated. When the additional refresher training call-ups reached their full extent, Finland had brought roughly 300,000 soldiers to their war positions out of a total population of 3.5 million people. The proportional military mobilization was among the highest of any country in the war. Almost every able-bodied Finnish man of appropriate age was in uniform. The sparsely populated, largely agrarian economy was under severe strain as a result. Farms were left short-handed, factories were understaffed, but the political will to make that sacrifice existed and was acted upon. There was a critical weakness, though, and it was one that Mannerheim had been warning about for years. Finland's stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and military supplies were dangerously inadequate. At the outbreak of war, Finnish stocks of cartridges, artillery shells, and fuel were sufficient for between 19 and 60 days of sustained combat, depending on the category. There were almost no anti-tank weapons, and Finnish tank forces were, in practical terms, non-existent. Finland had 32 tanks against the Soviet Union's several thousand. The Finns had 114 aircraft. The Soviets had nearly 4,000. The gap in material terms was not a disadvantage. It was a chasm. I keep returning to the ammunition calculation, 19 to 60 days, because it defines the entire strategic shape of the Winter War. Finland didn't have the supplies to wage a long war. Every Finnish commander, from Mannerheim downward, knew this. The only viable strategy was to make the cost of the Soviet advance so high, so immediately and obviously high, that Moscow would either agree to negotiate on acceptable terms or become internationally isolated to a degree that made the cost politically unsupportable. It was not a strategy based on the hope of military victory in any conventional sense. It was a strategy based on making the price of conquest exceed what Stalin was willing to pay. The Molotov cocktail deserves its own moment here, because it has passed into military folklore in a way that doesn't fully capture what it meant in context. The Finnish army adopted the improvised incendiary weapon, a glass bottle filled with flammable liquid with a simple fuse, as a response to the acute shortage of anti-tank weapons. What's less widely remembered is that Finnish production of these weapons was eventually industrialized. The Finnish Alko Corporation, which manufactured alcoholic beverages, was retooled to produce Molotov cocktails at scale, bundled with matches. When the Finnish radio mocked Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov's claim that Soviet aircraft were dropping humanitarian food parcels on Finland rather than bombs, they called the bombs Molotov bread baskets and called the response weapons Molotov cocktails, a drink to go with the food. The sardonic humor was real and it mattered. It was a marker of how Finland was processing the war. Finnish defensive preparations on the Karelian Isthmus were largely complete by the time the Soviets arrived. The covering forces, roughly 21,000 men deployed in front of the main line, had the specific mission of delaying the advance and inflicting casualties before falling back to the line itself. By the 6th of December, Finnish Independence Day, all the covering forces had withdrawn to the Mannerheim Line. The Red Army arrived at the forward edge of those fortifications and prepared to break through what its own propaganda would later describe as a nearly impregnable barrier. It was not impregnable, but it would hold far longer than anyone in Moscow had planned for. Chapter 5. The First Soviet Assault, December 1939. The 30th of November 1939 began before dawn. At 0800 hours, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border along the entire length of the frontier, from the Karelian Isthmus in the south to the Arctic tundra in the far north. On the isthmus, roughly 250,000 Red Army soldiers faced 130,000 Finns. In the air over Helsinki, Soviet bombers appeared and began dropping ordnance on the capital. About 100 civilians were killed and more than 50 buildings destroyed. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, informed of the bombing, offered one of the most extraordinary statements in the diplomatic record of the entire war. He told the international community that the Soviet Air Force was not bombing Finnish cities. It was, he said, dropping humanitarian aid to the starving Finnish population. The Finns, who were not starving and were now watching their capital burn, coined a phrase immediately. They called the bombs Molotov bread baskets. The bitterness in that phrase is something that didn't need translation. On the same day the invasion began, the Soviet Union announced the formation of a new government for Finland, called the Finnish Democratic Republic. It was headed by Otto-Ville Kuusinen, a Finnish communist who had been living in the Soviet Union for 2 decades. This puppet regime, quickly known as the Terijoki government after the first Finnish village seized by the advancing Red Army, was intended to serve as the legitimate government of a post-conquest Finland. The message was unambiguous. The Soviet Union wasn't simply seeking border adjustments. It was preparing to install a government of its choosing over a country it expected to overrun within weeks. This calculation failed almost immediately, and in a way that revealed something important about the Soviet misunderstanding of Finnish society. From the very first day of the invasion, Finland's working class, the factory workers, the timber cutters, the farm labourers, the very people that Soviet propaganda had been depicting as groaning under the boot of a fascist clique and awaiting liberation, stood almost uniformly behind the Helsinki government. The Social Democratic Party, which represented Finnish organised labour and was the largest single party in the Finnish parliament, condemned the invasion without reservation. Väinö Tanner, the Social Democratic leader who was both a prominent union figure and a particular target of Soviet propaganda, became foreign minister. The class solidarity that Soviet theory predicted would override Finnish nationalism simply didn't materialize. The initial Soviet advance on the Karelian Isthmus proceeded with the mechanical momentum of an army that had been told it would meet minimal resistance and had organized its logistics accordingly. Soviet soldiers had been warned, in some units, not to cross the Swedish border by mistake. Such was the confidence of a campaign expected to last 2 weeks. The covering Finnish forces delayed, fought, and fell back in good order. Soviet armor pushed forward along the roads, which were the only practical routes through the dense forests. The terrain north and south of those roads was largely impassable for heavy mechanized vehicles. Then the Red Army reached the Mannerheim Line, and the 2-week campaign ran into its first serious obstacle, the Battle of Taipale. At the eastern end of the isthmus, where the Taipale River met the shore of Lake Ladoga, became the site of the first major Soviet assault against prepared Finnish defenses. The Soviet artillery prepared the ground with a 40-hour barrage. Then the infantry advanced across open ground and was thrown back with heavy casualties. The Soviet command sent reinforcements, added tanks, brought up additional artillery. The Finns, who had spent months surveying the ground and preparing fire plans in anticipation of exactly this kind of assault, held. One detail from the Battle of Taipale stuck with me when I was researching this. A single Soviet infantry assault during this period lasted roughly 1 hour and left approximately 1,000 Soviet soldiers dead and 27 tanks strewn across the ice. That's not an abstract statistic. That's the cost, measured in human lives, of a single failed hour of fighting in one sector of one battle. The Red Army continued sending men into those same positions day after day for weeks, against fortifications that hadn't moved. The tactical creativity that such a situation demanded was simply not available in an officer corps that had been purged of its most experienced and independently thinking commanders. North of Lake Ladoga, in the region called Ladoga-Karelia, the situation was different in character, but no less costly for the Soviets. The terrain there was a dense forest wilderness with almost no road network. The Soviet Eighth Army had extended a new railroad line to the border, which could double supply capacity in theory, but on the ground, the army was almost entirely dependent on the few roads that existed, which meant Soviet columns moved in long, vulnerable files through forest that they didn't understand and couldn't navigate. On the 12th of December, at a place called Tolvajärvi, a much smaller Finnish force under Commander Paavo Talvala defeated the advancing Soviet 139th Rifle Division. It was the first clear Finnish battlefield victory of the war, and it mattered disproportionately to morale on both sides. In central and northern Finland, a vast region of forest and tundra with roads few enough to count, the Soviets deployed 8 divisions with heavy armor and artillery support. This was the sector where the most dramatic Finnish tactical innovation would eventually occur. But in early December, it was still a sector of advancing Soviet columns, tentative Finnish resistance, and logistical improvisation on both sides. The Soviet Ninth Army was positioned to drive westward through the Kainuu region and cut Finland in half. The 14th Army in Murmansk had captured the Arctic port of Petsamo in the far north by early December, severing Finland's only ice-free harbour. I want to stop here for a moment, because there's something about the scale of this that I think deserves to be stated plainly. By mid-December of 1939, the Soviet Union had committed between 450,000 and 600,000 men to the Finnish campaign. Finland had roughly 300,000 soldiers, chronically short of ammunition, almost without tanks, massively outmatched in aircraft. The initial Soviet assault had failed to break the Mannerheim Line and was failing in the forests of central Finland too. But it hadn't been stopped. It had been slowed. and Finland was burning through its carefully rationed ammunition supplies with every passing day. Chapter 6: Motti, the Art of Encirclement in the Frozen Forest. Here is where the story becomes something that military historians still study, and where the gap between what the numbers predicted and what actually happened became most extreme. In the forests of central Finland, in temperatures that dropped to minus 43 degrees Celsius on some nights, Finnish ski troops developed and executed a series of tactical encirclements that destroyed entire Soviet divisions, not by outgunning them, but by using movement, cold, forest, and darkness in ways that the Red Army had no tactical doctrine to counter. The Finnish word is motti. It means a cord of firewood, a specific unit of measure, roughly a cubic meter of stacked timber. The Finns adopted it as military terminology because the tactic it described resembled the process of cutting a long log into manageable pieces. When a Soviet mechanized column moved through a forest road in a long single file, which was the only way it could move, given the terrain, Finnish ski troops would attack simultaneously at the front and the rear. They would cut the column's communications, destroy the vehicles at each end, and then proceed to divide the trapped mass into smaller and smaller sections, each isolated, each unable to maneuver, each dependent on supply lines that no longer existed. The conditions that made this possible are important to understand precisely, because the motti tactic wasn't simply cleverness. It was the application of specific environmental factors that created a very specific kind of military vulnerability. Soviet mechanized forces in 1939 were designed to fight in open terrain with road networks. The Polish plains, the Ukrainian steppe, the kind of ground where blitzkrieg-style concentration of armor and speed was decisive. The Finnish forest was essentially the opposite of that. There were no paved roads. Even gravel roads were scarce. The forest floor in winter was a mix of deep snow and frozen ground, impassable for anything that couldn't ski or move on its own legs. A tank column on a forest road in winter was, in tactical terms, closer to a train than to a free-moving force. It could go forward or backward. It couldn't go sideways. Soviet soldiers at this stage of the war also hadn't been issued winter camouflage. Their tanks and vehicles were painted standard olive drab. Their uniforms were khaki. In a landscape that was uniformly white with snow, Soviet columns were visible from considerable distances to Finnish scouts moving through the forest on skis in white capes. It wasn't until late January of 1940 that the Soviets began painting equipment white and issuing snowsuits to their infantry. For the first 2 months of the war, the color contrast alone was a significant tactical disadvantage. The Battle of Suomussalmi, fought between December of 1939 and January of 1940, became the defining illustration of the motti tactic and remains the most studied Finnish operation of the entire war. The Soviet 163rd Rifle Division had been ordered to advance westward along the Raute Road, cross the narrow waste of Finland near the town of Suomussalmi, and effectively cut the country in half. Finnish forces under Colonel Hjalmar Siilasvuo allowed the division to advance deep into Finnish territory, then moved to cut its supply line and rear. A second Soviet division, the 44th, was ordered to advance along the Raute Road to relieve the encircled 163rd. What followed across December and early January was a slow, extraordinarily costly process of attrition, carried out in conditions that were arguably the most hostile on any front of the Second World War. At Suomussalmi, the temperature dropped well below minus 30 degrees. Soviet soldiers, trapped in columns that could no longer move or receive supply, burned vehicles for warmth and left fires burning at night, marking their exact positions for Finnish ski patrols who could move through the darkness without any visible signature. Frostbite casualties in some Soviet units reached 10%, before they had even crossed the Finnish border. In the encirclements, they were catastrophic. I want to be careful here about something important, because the Winter War is sometimes discussed in ways that aestheticize the Finnish tactical achievement without adequately registering what it cost the men on both sides. The trapped Soviet divisions were not simply defeated. They disintegrated slowly over weeks in conditions of suffering that are almost impossible to reconstruct fully from the archival record. These were Soviet conscripts, most of them young men from farms and factories across the vast USA, who had been told they were going on a 2-week campaign to liberate Finnish workers from fascism, and who found themselves instead freezing to death in forests they couldn't navigate, unable to understand why the liberation wasn't working, unable to receive orders that made any tactical sense given the situation they were in. That's not glory for anyone involved. It's a catastrophe dressed up as a military operation. The outcome at Suomussalmi, when it finally concluded in early January of 1940, was staggering by any measure. 2 Soviet divisions had been effectively destroyed, not simply beaten, but broken as functional military formations. The Finnish forces involved were considerably smaller. Soviet materiel losses included hundreds of vehicles, dozens of artillery pieces, quantities of supplies that the Finns desperately needed and now absorbed into their own inventory. Finnish soldiers looting the bodies of dead Soviet soldiers for ammunition was not uncommon. The Soviet Mosin-Nagant rifles used the same cartridge as the Finnish standard rifle, which was itself a Mosin-Nagant variant, and every recovered round extended Finland's fighting capacity by one more pull of the trigger. The wider picture of December was, from the Soviet perspective, deeply embarrassing. Every single front had either stalled or was performing far below the expectations that had underpinned the invasion planning. On the Karelian Isthmus, the Mannerheim Line had not been breached. North of Lake Ladoga, Finnish defensive operations were holding. In central Finland, the Motti tactics were destroying Soviet columns. In the Arctic North, the 14th Army had seized Petsamo, but couldn't advance further in any meaningful way. The League of Nations, meeting in emergency session, expelled the Soviet Union from its membership on the 14th of December, an act of international censure that didn't change anything militarily, but stripped Moscow of any remaining diplomatic legitimacy for the operation. The Soviet Union's international reputation, already complicated by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the invasion of Poland, was now additionally damaged by the expulsion from the League and by the near-daily reports from Western correspondents who had made their way to Finland and were filing dispatches describing a small democracies holding off the Soviet colossus. International sympathy for Finland was genuine and widespread. 13 countries sent material support. Sweden, maintaining formal neutrality, allowed volunteers to travel to Finland and sent substantial quantities of equipment. France and Britain were making plans, somewhat belated and logistically complicated plans, for possible military intervention. None of this changed the fundamental arithmetic. Finland was fighting alone, with dwindling supplies against an opponent that had been humiliated but had not been stopped. And in Moscow, the humiliation was not being absorbed passively. Stalin was already making the changes that would produce the second Soviet offensive, the one that the Mannerheim Line would not survive. End of chapters 1 through 6. Chapters 7 through 15 continue the complete documentary series, A Note on Sources. The factual backbone of this script is drawn from primary historical documentation, including the Wikipedia entry on the Winter War and its background articles, the Imperial War Museum's historical summary, Britannica's archival entry on the Russo-Finnish War, the Presidential Library of Russia's published timeline, the Mannerheim Line structural record, EBSCO research starters, and Finnish tactical doctrine analysis. Casualty figures are sourced from the most conservative, cross-referenced estimates available, where historiographical debate exists, particularly on Soviet intentions and the scale of planned conquest. That debate has been represented rather than resolved. Chapter 7: The Reorganization. Stalin's correction and the coming storm. There is a moment in the story of almost every large institutional failure where the people responsible for the failure either double down on the same approach or do something harder. They admit it isn't working and start over. Stalin, for all the catastrophic judgments he made in other contexts, did the latter in Finland. By mid-December of 1939, with 3 Soviet divisions destroyed or encircled, the Mannerheim Line unbroken, and Western correspondents filing dispatches that were making the Red Army look incompetent in every capital in the world, Stalin changed his approach. He didn't change his objective. He changed everything else. The restructuring began with personnel. Kirill Meretskov, the commander of the Leningrad military district who had planned the original campaign, was quietly relieved of tactical command. His replacement was Semyon Timoshenko, a cavalry general who had distinguished himself in the Russian Civil War and the campaigns in Poland and the Baltic. Timoshenko was not a military genius by the standards that history applies to that term, but he was something the Finnish campaign had been desperately lacking. He was a competent, experienced, professionally serious commander who understood that military operations required preparation, coordination, and adequate supply before they required courage or ideology. Timoshenko arrived in Leningrad at the end of December and spent the next 6 weeks doing something that the original Soviet timetable had considered entirely unnecessary. He prepared the reorganization of the Northwestern Front, as the entire Finnish operation was now redesignated, elevated from a military district operation to a full front-level command, was comprehensive. The previous dual command structure, where political commissars had authority to countermand operational orders, was adjusted to give field commanders greater autonomy. Artillery was concentrated and coordinated at levels that the first phase of the campaign had never achieved. Engineer units were brought up specifically to deal with the concrete fortifications of the Mannerheim Line. The artillery concentration that Timoshenko assembled on the Karelian Isthmus by early February of 1940 was of a scale that Finland simply couldn't match. Soviet accounts from this period describe roughly 900 guns per kilometer of front being prepared for the initial bombardment, a density that represents, in practical terms, the ability to destroy almost any fixed position with enough time and ordnance. Finnish fortifications that had been built to withstand small arms fire and light artillery would now face siege guns firing 203mm shells, projectiles the size of a large man, at targets that had been surveyed and registered weeks in advance. The Mannerheim Line had been an adequate defense against an army with poor coordination and insufficient preparation. Against what Timoshenko was assembling, it was something different. One of the aspects of this period that doesn't get adequate attention is what the pause in major offensive operations meant for the Finnish side. On one level, the relative quiet of January was a gift. It gave Finnish soldiers time to rest, units time to reorganize, ammunition stocks time to be partially replenished through international deliveries. But on another level, the pause was ominous, precisely because it was so uncharacteristic. Finnish military intelligence, such as it was, could see the Soviet build-up happening. The sound of rail traffic behind Soviet lines was continuous. The accumulated evidence pointed in one direction. The next offensive would not be another disorganized rush. It would be systematic. I've spent time with the accounts of Finnish soldiers from this period, letters home, diary entries, post-war memoirs. And what strikes me most is the particular quality of the fear. It isn't the fear of the first days of the war, which was acute and immediate. It's quieter, more settled, more difficult to name. It's the fear of men who have been performing beyond what anyone expected of them, who know that their performance has been extraordinary, and who are beginning to understand that extraordinary performance may not be enough. One Finnish officer, writing to his family during this period, described the mood on the isthmus as tired but not broken. That distinction, tired but not broken, captures the moment better than anything I could construct from a distance of 80 years. The international situation during January and early February was shifting in ways that Finland's government watched with intense, anxious attention. Britain and France had been discussing intervention, some kind of expeditionary force that might pass through neutral Norway and Sweden to reach Finland. The problem was that both Norway and Sweden refused to allow Allied troops to cross their territory, partly out of genuine commitment to neutrality and partly out of realistic fear of becoming theatres of war themselves. Sweden, in particular, was in an acutely uncomfortable position. It had sent substantial volunteer forces and material to Finland, but it wasn't willing to risk becoming a Soviet or German target by allowing organized Allied military operations through its territory. Germany's position was also relevant, and it complicates the story in ways that Finland's post-war national memory has sometimes found it awkward to acknowledge. Germany was, at this moment, the Soviet Union's partner under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. German policy actively discouraged other countries from providing material support to Finland, and German diplomacy worked to prevent Allied intervention. At the same time, Germany had no direct interest in seeing Finland conquered. A Soviet-dominated Finland would put Soviet forces on the Norwegian border and significantly complicate German strategic options in Scandinavia. Berlin was, in effect, watching the Winter War as a spectator, with complicated interests and no good options, which is an uncomfortable position for a country that had just reorganized Europe by force. Finland's most important diplomatic effort during January and early February was directed at obtaining a direct intervention by the Allied powers, or, failing that, opening a channel back to Moscow for a negotiated peace before the second Soviet offensive broke the Mannerheim Line. Both paths were difficult. The Allies were willing to send a force, eventually, but eventually wasn't a timeline that matched Finland's military reality. And Moscow, having invested enormously in the Finnish operation and suffered humiliating losses, was not eager to negotiate from a position that could be read as weakness. Not without first demonstrating that the Red Army could accomplish what it had claimed it could accomplish. So both sides prepared for what both sides knew was coming. On the Karelian Isthmus, Finnish defenders worked to deepen their trenches and repair positions damaged in the first phase of the fighting. Engineers laid additional minefields. Artillery positions were adjusted based on what had been learned in December. In the Soviet camp across the border, the machinery of the second offensive moved forward with the unhurried precision of an operation that had been given adequate time to prepare. Timoshenko had requested 6 weeks. He used every one of them. The February thaw, which typically began to soften the ice on the Gulf of Finland and reduce the trafficability of the frozen ground, was perhaps 6 weeks away. The window for a decisive offensive on the isthmus was finite. Both sides knew it. Chapter 8. The second offensive. The Mannerheim Line breaks. The 1st of February 1940 began the way that Finnish soldiers on the Karelian Isthmus had been dreading since January, with artillery. The Soviet preliminary bombardment that preceded Timoshenko's offensive was not the rushed, poorly coordinated artillery preparation of December. It was systematic, Soviet guns fired in extended timed sequences on registered targets. Finnish bunkers, command posts, communication lines, ammunition stores. The areas immediately behind the front line, where Finnish reserves would be held, the bombardment continued for 3 days before any infantry moved forward. By the time the first Soviet soldiers reached the Finnish forward positions, much of the outer structure of the Mannerheim Line had already been reduced. The main assault on the isthmus began on the 11th of February. Timoshenko's concentrated force drove into the Finnish defensive position at its weakest point, the Suma sector, where the terrain was relatively open compared to other parts of the line and where Finnish reserves were thinnest. The Soviet approach was methodical in a way that December had not been. Infantry with tanks in close support, engineers immediately behind to clear obstacles and mines. Artillery maintained on a rolling program that moved its fire forward as the infantry advanced. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't the kind of dynamic maneuver warfare that would later define the Eastern Front, but it was effective against a position that had been pounded for 10 days and was defended by an army running low on everything. What happened at Suma on the 11th and 12th of February remains a subject of considerable discussion among Finnish military historians, because the exact sequence of events that led to the line's penetration isn't fully documented. What is clear is that by the afternoon of the 12th, Soviet forces had created a breach in the Finnish main defensive line, the first genuine breach since the war began. Finnish reserves moved to seal the gap and were partially successful. But partially successful, in this context, meant that the penetration was contained but not eliminated. The Soviet force was inside the line. I want to be precise about what breaking the Mannerheim Line meant in practice, because the phrase can be misleading. It didn't mean that the entire defensive structure collapsed simultaneously. It meant that at one point, Suma, the continuous defensive front, had been interrupted. Finnish forces pulled back from positions that were now outflanked, and the line as a connected system was no longer fully intact. The Finnish command response was to begin a fighting withdrawal, pulling forces back to secondary and tertiary positions, rather than attempting to hold ground that could now be attacked from the flank. Mannerheim authorized the retreat with characteristic precision, ordering it conducted in full order, maintaining cohesion, which is the kind of instruction that sounds straightforward and is, in practice, among the most difficult things an army under pressure can execute. The Finnish retreat was not a rout. Every account, Finnish, Soviet, and neutral, agrees on that. Finnish units withdrew under fire, maintaining their organization, taking their wounded and their weapons, establishing new positions behind the main line, and holding them as long as their ammunition lasted. The Soviet advance was slowed at every new position by the same combination of terrain knowledge and defensive preparation that had characterized Finnish operations from the beginning. But slow wasn't the same as stopped. The direction of movement was backward, and it was continuous. Viipuri, Finland's second city, a historic port city on the Karelian Isthmus, with a population of roughly 80,000, became the new focal point. It was the most significant urban area in the combat zone, and the obvious objective for the Soviet advance once the main line was broken. Finnish forces established a defensive perimeter around the city and held it in brutal close quarters fighting through February and into early March. The fighting in and around Viipuri was of a different character from the forest battles further north. Urban, close range, conducted street by street through a city that its own defenders knew was probably going to fall. North of Lake Ladoga, the situation in February took a dramatic turn in the Soviet Union's favor. The Moty encirclements that had been the centerpiece of Finnish tactical success in December and January were now coming under sustained Soviet pressure to break from the outside. Additional Soviet forces had been brought up and properly supplied. Finnish forces in the northern sectors were facing the same supply problems that had plagued the Red Army in December. A terrible symmetry that reflected how completely both sides had been stretched by a war that was supposed to have lasted 2 weeks, but was now entering its third month. I find one of the less discussed aspects of this period to be the psychological dimension, not just for Finnish soldiers, but for the Finnish civilian population. Finland had been at war since November. The blackout curtains had been up for more than 2 months. Children in the cities had been evacuated to the countryside. The daily casualty lists were being read by a population small enough that almost everyone knew someone on them. And yet, the Finnish home front, by the accounts of foreign correspondents and neutral observers, didn't crack. The social democratic movement remained aligned with the government. The Lutheran Church supported the war. The rural population mobilized its resources with minimal coercion. Whatever the Talvisodan Henki, the spirit of the Winter War, was composed of, it proved more durable than either Finnish pessimists or Soviet planners had expected. The Gulf of Finland, normally a significant natural barrier, was frozen solid by mid-February, a consequence of one of the coldest winters in the recorded history of the region. This was catastrophic for Finland in one crucial way that deserves to be spelled out. The frozen Gulf allowed Soviet forces to move across the ice to outflank Viipuri from the west, bypassing the Finnish coastal defences entirely and threatening to encircle the city's garrison from a direction for which the defensive preparations were entirely inadequate. Finnish ski troops and coastal units fought desperately on the ice, in conditions that were inhuman by any measure, to slow this flanking movement. They slowed it, but they couldn't stop it. By the 1st of March 1940, the situation on the Karelian Isthmus was becoming irreversible. Finnish forces were holding, but they were holding at the cost of casualties that a country of 3.5 million people could not indefinitely sustain. The reserve divisions that Mannerheim had held back for precisely this kind of crisis were now committed. The ammunition stocks that had been the central constraint of Finnish strategy since November were now critically depleted. And the Allied intervention that Finland had been hoping for, the British-French expeditionary force that had been discussed, debated, and planned for weeks, was still weeks away from any possibility of arrival, if it came at all. Finland's government faced a decision that had no good options. It could keep fighting toward a collapse, or it could seek terms before the collapse arrived. Chapter 9. The Human Cost, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Cold. There is a particular problem that any historian of the Winter War has to navigate, and it is one I want to acknowledge directly. The casualty figures for this conflict are among the most disputed in the historiography of the Second World War. The Finnish numbers are relatively well documented. The Finnish government maintained systematic records throughout, and post-war research has refined them considerably. The Soviet figures are another matter. Soviet records were classified for decades, accessible initially only to approved researchers, and the numbers that appeared in Soviet-era official histories were considerably lower than the figures that emerged after the Soviet archives were partially opened in the 1990s. The Finnish government's official figures, as published in post-war assessments, record approximately 25,000 Finnish soldiers killed in action or died of wounds during the 105 days of the war. A further 43,000 were wounded. The proportion of killed to wounded is higher than for most modern conflicts, which reflects the conditions. Extreme cold, inadequate medical evacuation routes, and the severity of wounds caused by artillery and high-velocity rifle fire at short range. Finnish civilian casualties from Soviet bombing were recorded at approximately 960 killed and approximately 1,540 wounded over the course of the war. Significant numbers for a country at its scale, and a marker of the Soviet bombing campaign's sustained targeting of Finnish population centers. The Soviet figures are where the historiographical argument becomes genuinely complicated. Soviet official history initially stated approximately 48,000 killed. Post-Soviet research, drawing on declassified military records, produced figures substantially higher. Most serious historians now work with a figure of between 125,000 and 168,000 Soviet soldiers killed or died of wounds, with a further 200,000 or more wounded, captured, or missing. The range in these estimates reflects genuine uncertainty in the source material, not evasion. Some units' records were destroyed, others were never fully compiled. The chaos of the early months, in particular, makes precise accounting nearly impossible. There is also the category of non-combat casualties, which the clean killed wounded missing tables of military history consistently understate. Frostbite, hypothermia, trench foot, respiratory infections that became fatal pneumonia in men whose immune systems were already compromised by exhaustion, inadequate nutrition, and sustained exposure to temperatures well below anything their training had prepared them for. Finnish estimates of Soviet non-combat casualties from cold injury alone reach into the tens of thousands. Soviet medical records, where they exist, confirm that frostbite casualty rates in some units during December and January exceeded their combat casualty rates. It's a category of suffering that doesn't get mentioned in battle narratives, but that defined the experience of the war for a very large number of the men involved. I think about a specific detail that appeared in the post-war accounts of Finnish soldiers who operated in the Suomussalmi sector. When the Finnish forces moved through the destroyed Soviet columns in January of 1940, they reported finding Soviet soldiers frozen in the positions they had died in, not lying down, but sitting upright against trees or vehicle wheels, as if they had simply stopped moving and the cold had done the rest. The detail was recorded by multiple independent witnesses and appears in several post-war Finnish memoirs. I raise it not for dramatic effect, but because it illustrates something important about the conditions. Men were dying not in dramatic battle actions, but in the quiet, incremental way that extreme cold kills, and the scale of that dying was enormous. Finnish soldiers had their own severe hardships, and Finnish post-war accounts are honest about this in ways that the wartime propaganda was not. The Mannerheim Line had been designed, in theory, to provide covered shelter and support for its defenders. In practice, many positions were incomplete, under-resourced, and in some sectors entirely dependent on field-expedient construction. Finnish soldiers on the isthmus spent weeks in dugouts and trenches in temperatures that dropped below -20. Rotation out of forward positions was infrequent because there weren't enough reserve forces to allow regular rotation. Men stayed in the line for extended periods without adequate sleep, under intermittent artillery bombardment, knowing that the supply situation behind them was getting worse rather than better. The civilian dimension of the Winter War operated on several levels. The most immediate was evacuation. When Soviet forces broke through the Mannerheim Line in February, the Finnish government faced the requirement to evacuate the civilian population of the Karelian Isthmus ahead of the advancing front. The population of the isthmus, roughly 400,000 people, was evacuated in winter conditions with limited transport in a matter of weeks. The logistics of this operation were formidable, and the human cost was significant. Families forced to leave homes, farms, and belongings that had been in their possession for generations, most of them with no real expectation that they would ever return. The evacuation was largely successful in the narrow logistical sense. Most people got out. What they left behind was irretrievable. The broader home front mobilization that Finland sustained throughout the war was, by the standards of any comparable small country, extraordinary. The women's auxiliary organizations, the Lotta-Svärd, a women's paramilitary volunteer corps with roots going back to the Civil War, contributed over 100,000 women to support roles during the Winter War, serving in field hospitals, communications posts, anti-aircraft observer stations, and logistics functions across the country. Their contribution to keeping the Finnish military functional during the war is difficult to overstate, and it was largely invisible in the immediate post-war international reporting, which focused on the ski troops and the motti tactics. The Lotta-Svärd was doing essential work without which none of the celebrated tactical operations would have been logistically possible. International humanitarian response to the Finnish situation was substantial by the standards of a world already at war. The American Red Cross organized a relief campaign that raised significant funds. The Swedish Red Cross sent medical personnel and supplies. Voluntary contributions from Finnish diaspora communities in North America and elsewhere helped finance equipment purchases. Several neutral countries sent diplomatic notes of concern or sympathy. None of this changed the military equation, and it mattered to the Finnish government and Finnish people in ways that were more than symbolic. To be fighting alone against a vastly larger opponent, and to know that the watching world's sympathy was genuine, provided a kind of moral sustenance that didn't appear in the order of battle, but was nonetheless real. Mannerheim himself, in his post-war memoir, wrote about this period with a controlled grief that is characteristic of his prose style throughout the memoir. He was not a man who wrote to express emotion, but the emotion is present underneath the precise military language if you read carefully. He was a commander who could see, with increasing clarity, that the war was moving toward a conclusion that didn't match the effort his soldiers had made. He had argued against the war before it started. He had commanded it with exceptional skill once it began, and now he was watching it move toward a peace that would cost Finland deeply. Not because his soldiers had failed him, but because the arithmetic of small nations against large ones eventually asserts itself regardless of tactical brilliance. That's a specific kind of grief, and his memoir carries it on every page. Chapter 10. Diplomacy. Under Fire, the Path to the Moscow Peace. By the second week of February 1940, the Finnish government understood with clarity what Mannerheim had been telling them for weeks. Finland couldn't hold indefinitely, and the longer it waited to open negotiations, the worse the terms it would face when it finally had to. The question wasn't whether to negotiate. The question was how to do it in a way that preserved as much as possible, and how to do it without being perceived domestically as simply surrendering to superior force. The difference between those two things, a negotiated settlement and a capitulation, matters enormously in the political history of small nations, and the Finnish government navigated that distinction with considerable care. The initial contact with Moscow came through Sweden. The Swedish government, which had maintained a careful formal neutrality while providing substantial informal support to Finland, agreed to act as an intermediary. In late January, even before the Mannerheim Line had been breached, Swedish Foreign Minister Christian Gunher communicated to Moscow that Finland was prepared to consider serious negotiations. The Soviet response was not immediately encouraging. Moscow was by this point aware that the second offensive's preparation was nearly complete, and there was limited incentive to negotiate before demonstrating that the Red Army could accomplish what it had claimed it would accomplish. The Finnish government formally requested Swedish mediation on the 12th of February, the same day that Soviet forces achieved their first penetration of the Mannerheim Line. The timing was not coincidental. Finnish Foreign Minister Väinö Tanner flew to Stockholm on the 13th to begin direct contact with Soviet representatives. What he found in Stockholm was a Soviet position substantially harder than the one that had been on the table in October and November, which made a grim kind of sense. The Soviets had lost more men and more prestige than they had expected. The terms they would accept in exchange for ending the war had become correspondingly more severe. The Soviet demands as they emerged through February were these. Finland would cede the entire Karelian Isthmus, including Viipuri. Finland would cede the northern shore of Lake Ladoga and the city of Sortavala. Finland would cede the Hanko Peninsula for a 30-year lease for a Soviet naval base. Additional territories along the Arctic coast and in the Lake Ladoga area would be ceded. Finland would not join any alliance hostile to the Soviet Union. The total area of ceded territory was approximately 11% of Finland's pre-war land area, and it contained approximately 12% of the pre-war population. The 400,000 people of the Karelian Isthmus would need to be resettled inside Finland's new reduced borders. The Finnish government debated these terms throughout late February and into early March with a mixture of anguish and realism. Mannerheim was consulted extensively. He had been arguing for negotiation since January, and his professional assessment was unambiguous. Finland had weeks, not months, before the military situation became catastrophic. The British and French were still dangling the possibility of intervention, but their own planning showed that no meaningful Allied force could reach Finland before April, at the earliest. And April was too late. There was also a specific provision in the Allied offer that gave the Finnish government serious pause. The intervention force would pass through Norway and Sweden in a manner that would almost certainly bring those countries into the war. And Finland didn't want to be responsible for triggering a wider Scandinavian conflict as the price of its own survival. I find the internal Finnish political debate of these weeks to be one of the most morally serious episodes in the entire story. There were people in the Finnish parliament and government who genuinely argued that Finland should keep fighting, even at the cost of complete military collapse. That surrender, even on negotiated terms, was worse than defeat, and that an occupied Finland could still resist. They weren't obviously wrong in principle. There were also those who argued, with equal moral seriousness, that the purpose of government is to protect the people who live under it, and that a government that chooses national honour over the physical survival of its citizens has made a category error about what government is for. Mannerheim was in the end in this second camp, so was Tanner. So was Prime Minister Risto Ryti. On the 6th of March 1940, a Finnish peace delegation flew to Moscow. It was led by Prime Minister Ryti and included Foreign Minister Tanner and several other senior officials. The Moscow negotiations lasted 5 days. The Soviet negotiators, Molotov leading, with Stalin present for key sessions, pressed hard on every point but didn't materially alter the terms that had been conveyed through Stockholm. The Finns tried to limit the Hanko lease and to secure Finland's right to transit communications through the ceded territories. They achieved some minor modifications, but not the substantial ones they sought. One of the genuine historiographical debates about the Moscow negotiations concerns what the Soviets' actual bottom line was. Some Finnish historians have argued that Moscow might have accepted somewhat less favorable terms in exchange for a faster conclusion. That Finland left something on the table by not pressing harder on the Hanko question or the border details further north. Soviet sources, where they have been accessible, suggest that the terms Finland received were essentially the minimums that Stalin had approved. What's probably most accurate is that both sides were negotiating under intense time pressure. The military situation was deteriorating for Finland every day, and the Soviet Union had its own reasons to want the war concluded before British-French intervention became a reality, and that this mutual urgency produced a settlement that neither side found comfortable. The Peace of Moscow was signed on the 12th of March, 1940, at midnight. The ceasefire took effect at 1100 hours the following morning, the 13th of March. In the final hours before the ceasefire, there are accounts of Soviet forces attempting to push further into Finnish territory, specifically attempting to advance along the road toward Helsinki from the Viipuri direction, in an apparent effort to claim additional ground before the agreed time. Finnish forces held those positions until the ceasefire hour. That detail, fighting until the last moment, not ceding a meter more than the treaty required, is a small thing in the scale of the war, but it says something about what the Finnish army was. Word of the peace reached Finnish forward positions through the normal military communication channels. Many accounts describe the silence that followed the announcement. Not celebration, silence. The soldiers had held. The country had survived. But they had lost Viipuri and the isthmus and the homes of 400,000 people and 25,000 of their own dead. The silence was appropriate. It contained too much for any other response to carry properly. Chapter 11. The World Watches. International Reactions and Strategic Consequences. The Winter War ended on the 13th of March, 1940, and the reverberations moved through the international system with a speed and consequence that none of the major powers had fully anticipated. Finland had survived as an independent state. That fact alone was remarkable, given how the previous 6 months had gone for every small nation that found itself between the two great ideological empires. The Baltic states had signed away their sovereignty in the autumn. Poland had been partitioned. Finland had fought for 105 days and emerged, wounded and diminished, but intact. The most consequential international reaction to the Winter War was not the loudest one. Britain and France had expressed their sympathy vigorously. The League of Nations had expelled the Soviet Union. Volunteer fighters from Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Hungary, and other countries had served in the Finnish ranks, several thousand in total. All of that was real and had mattered to Finland's morale, and in some cases, its material situation. But the reaction that changed the trajectory of the Second World War was quieter, and it happened in the mind of one man in Berlin. Adolf Hitler had been watching the Winter War with the kind of focused professional attention that military planning requires. What he saw confirmed something that his own military planners had been tentatively suggesting, and that he himself had been inclined to believe. The Red Army, despite its enormous size and material resources, was a deeply deficient military instrument. Its officers didn't think independently. Its logistics were inadequate for sustained operations. Its tactical coordination between arms, artillery, armor, and infantry was poor. Its soldiers were brave, but often committed in ways that were wasteful and poorly directed. The Finnish campaign had put all of these weaknesses on public display for more than 3 months. The argument that Hitler's decision to pursue Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941, was influenced by his assessment of Soviet military performance in Finland is well established in the historiography, though its precise weight relative to other factors remains debated. Hitler told Mussolini in a documented meeting in March of 1941 that the Red Army was without leaders and that a swift campaign would destroy it before the winter came. His generals' planning assumptions for Barbarossa, that the Soviet Union would collapse in 8 to 10 weeks, reflect an institutional assessment that drew heavily on the Finnish evidence. Whether the Germans should have drawn different conclusions from the Soviet reorganization under Timoshenko is a separate question. What matters is what they actually concluded. For the Soviet Union, the Winter War's lessons were being absorbed at exactly the same time as its costs were being counted. The most significant institutional response was the military reform program that Timoshenko oversaw after being appointed People's Commissar of Defense in May of 1940. A direct consequence of the Finnish campaign's revelations, the dual command system was modified. Training standards were raised dramatically. The emphasis on political reliability over professional competence in officer selection was reduced, at least partially. Tactical doctrine was revised to place greater emphasis on combined arms coordination. These reforms were real, and they represented genuine institutional learning. They simply weren't complete by June of 1941, when Germany invaded. The international position of Finland, after the Moscow Peace, was uncomfortable in ways that the country would spend the next several years trying to navigate. The Soviet Union was still there, and still large, and had demonstrated that it was willing to use military force against Finland. Germany was the dominant power in continental Europe after the fall of France in June of 1940. Britain remained at war with Germany, but was in no position to do anything material for Finland. Sweden maintained its careful neutrality. Finland found itself geographically isolated, diplomatically limited, and facing the necessity of making strategic choices in a world where none of the available options were good. The resettlement of the Karelian evacuees was the most immediate domestic consequence of the war's end, and it was a logistical operation of a scale that Finland had never attempted. The roughly 400,000 people who had been evacuated from the ceded territories voluntarily in the weeks before the ceasefire needed to be permanently housed, employed, and integrated into a country that was itself exhausted and economically strained by 4 months of total mobilization. The Finnish government organized a systematic land redistribution program to provide the evacuees with farms and housing. The program worked in the sense that the resettlement was completed without the social breakdown that might have resulted from 400,000 suddenly homeless and dispossessed people. But the loss was permanent. Viipuri was now a Soviet city, renamed Vyborg, and would remain so. The League of Nations expulsion of the Soviet Union in December of 1939, which had felt like a significant international censure at the time, had a postscript that illustrated how quickly the strategic picture could shift. Less than 2 years later, after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the same Western powers who had expelled the Soviets from the League were now providing military and material aid to the Soviet Union under the logic of the enemy of my enemy. The moral clarity of December 1939 gave way to the strategic pragmatism of 1941, with a speed that taught anyone watching a clear lesson about the relationship between principle and geopolitics in the conduct of major wars. The volunteer fighters who had come to Finland from other countries faced their own complicated homecomings. Swedish volunteers, some 8,000 in total, returned to a Sweden that was publicly grateful for their service, but officially committed to neutrality that their service had technically compromised. Norwegian volunteers returned to a Norway that would itself be invaded by Germany 2 months after the Winter War ended. The volunteers from farther afield, Americans, British Hungarians, Italians, carried the Finnish story back with them to their home countries, and some of them wrote accounts that shaped the popular image of the war in their respective languages. The Finnish ski soldier became a minor but genuine figure in the international imagination of the early war years. Capable, stoic, equipped with improvised weapons, holding a line that everyone had said couldn't be held, Finland's own military took the lessons of the Winter War seriously and systematically. The ammunition shortage that had defined the entire strategic situation was addressed through an accelerated domestic production program and international procurement. The fortifications on the new post-Moscow border were studied and improved. The tactics that had worked, the Motiesi encirclements, the use of terrain, the ski-mobile small unit operations, were formalized into doctrine. The tactics that had nearly failed, the defense of fixed positions against concentrated artillery and engineer assault, were analyzed in detail. The Finnish army that went to war again in June of 1941, when Finland joined Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in what Finland calls the Continuation War, was a more experienced, better equipped, and doctrinally more sophisticated force than the one that had fought the Winter War. The Winter War's strategic legacy remains genuinely complex and genuinely important. It demonstrated that small, well-prepared, highly motivated forces could impose enormous costs on larger opponents operating in unfamiliar terrain. It revealed the catastrophic consequences of military purges on institutional competence. It showed that international sympathy, however genuine, had precise limits when it came to converting into material military support. And it raised a question about geopolitical scale that doesn't have a comfortable answer. At what point does the price of defending sovereignty exceed the price of negotiated compromise? And who has the right to make that calculation? Finland's government had to answer that question in real time, with imperfect information, under military pressure, in a matter of weeks. Looking at what they decided and what it cost, I don't think it's easy to say they were wrong. Chapter 12. The Long Shadow, Finland's Memory. And the war's meaning memory is a political act. This is not a cynical observation. It's simply an accurate one. What a nation chooses to remember about its wars, and how it chooses to frame those memories, tells you as much about the nation's present anxieties as it does about its actual past. Finland's memory of the Winter War is, in this sense, one of the more interesting case studies in 20th century European national memory, because it has had to carry an enormous weight while simultaneously being accurate about a genuinely ambiguous outcome. The core of Finnish Winter War memory is built around what is called sisu, a Finnish concept that resists clean translation into English. It contains elements of grit, perseverance, stubborn endurance, and the capacity to continue functioning under conditions that should, by any rational calculation, produce surrender or breakdown. The Winter War became the defining modern demonstration of sisu in Finnish national consciousness, and it has remained so for 80 years. This is understandable. The Finnish performance in the war was genuinely extraordinary by any objective standard. A country of 3.5 million people held off the Soviet Union for 105 days with chronically inadequate equipment and ammunition, inflicted casualties on a scale that no one had predicted, and preserved its independence. That is a genuine achievement, and it deserves to be remembered as one. The complexity in Finnish memory comes from what happened next. The Continuation War, Finland's participation alongside Germany in the invasion of the Soviet Union beginning in June of 1941, is a chapter of Finnish history that sits uncomfortably beside the Winter War in the national narrative. The Winter War is remembered as pure self-defense. Finland attacked, Finland resisted, Finland survived. The Continuation War is more morally complicated. Finland as co-belligerent with Nazi Germany, advancing into Soviet territory beyond the pre-Winter War borders, participating in an operation that had the character of conquest as well as recovery. Finnish historians and politicians have been working through that complexity since 1945, and the conversation isn't finished. The Soviet Union, and then Russia, had its own complex relationship with the Winter War's memory. For decades, the Soviet official line minimized the war's significance and kept the casualty figures classified. To acknowledge the scale of the losses would have been to acknowledge the scale of the failure. And the Soviet system wasn't architecturally suited to that kind of acknowledgement while it was still operating. After the Soviet archives became partially accessible in the 1990s, Russian historians produced work of genuine quality on the Winter War, some of it remarkably frank about the purge's role in the Red Army's poor performance, and about the planned provocation at Mainila. The process of honest Russian historical accounting of the Winter War is still ongoing, and in the current political climate of Russia, it has become more difficult rather than less. The Mannerheim question has been particularly acute in Finnish public life in recent decades. Carl Gustaf Mannerheim is memorialized in Helsinki in ways that would make him the dominant figure in Finnish public space. A horseback statue, a museum in his former home, a cross-party consensus that he was the defining figure of Finland's 20th century. But Mannerheim was also a white commander in a civil war that killed nearly 40,000 Finns, many of them in prison camps after the fighting ended. His relationship with the Swedish-speaking Finnish aristocracy from which he came, and his personal remoteness from the Finnish-speaking majority of the country he served, are threads in the national conversation that don't get smoothed away simply because his role in the Winter War was exceptional. The Finnish relationship with Mannerheim is honest in the way that mature democracies are sometimes able to be honest about their foundational figures. They hold the contradiction rather than resolving it. The Karelian question, whether Finland should ever have sought the return of the territories ceded in the Moscow Peace, was a significant part of Finnish politics for decades after the Second World War, particularly given that Finland did temporarily recover most of the ceded territory during the Continuation War, only to lose it again in the Paris Peace Treaty of 1947. A movement for Karelian return existed in Finnish politics through the 1990s, supported most intensely by the descendants of the evacuees and by nationalist political factions. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and Russia emerged as its successor state, the question of whether a formal request for the return of Karelia was either politically viable or strategically wise occupied Finnish diplomatic thinking for years. The consensus that eventually emerged was essentially pragmatic. The territories were economically undeveloped. The Russian political cost of returning them was prohibitive, and the stability of the Finnish-Russian border relationship was more valuable than the symbolic recovery of lost ground. For the descendants of the Karelian evacuees, and there are now 3 or 4 generations of Finnish families descended from the people who left the isthmus in February of 1940. The question of memory has a different character from the national political one. It's personal. It's about specific farmhouses and specific villages and specific landscapes that appear in family photographs and family stories, but that most living family members have never seen except on day trip visits to what is now Russian territory. The Finnish concept of koti, home, carries a weight in this context that the English word doesn't fully convey. For the Karelian Finnish community, koti is a place that no longer exists in the form it was held in the memory. That's a specific kind of grief that doesn't appear in diplomatic cables or military histories, but it is a real consequence of the war, and it has been carried through Finnish families for more than 80 years. The broader lesson that the Winter War offered to the world about the nature of military power and its limits was absorbed differently by different audiences and with varying degrees of accuracy. The lesson that Hitler drew, that the Red Army was permanently and fundamentally broken, was wrong, and catastrophically so. The lesson that Western military observers drew, that highly motivated and well-trained small forces could compensate for material disadvantage in the right terrain, was more accurate, but also more limited in application than the Winter War's dramatic tactical outcomes suggested. The lesson that the Soviet military drew, that inadequate preparation, poor combined arms integration, and politically compromised command structures produced needless casualties and failed objectives, was accurate and was acted upon, at least partially. I want to say something here about the Finnish soldiers themselves, not as symbols of Sisu or as case studies in tactical doctrine, but as the thing they actually were. Men, most of them farmers and loggers and factory workers and students, who picked up rifles in November of 1939 and stood in snow-covered trenches and held a line for 105 days, because the government they had elected asked them to, and because they understood with unusual clarity what would happen to their country if they didn't. They weren't all brave. They weren't all dedicated. Some of them were frightened, some were resentful, some were cold and exhausted and angry and looking for someone to blame. The post-war memoirs and oral histories contain all of this. The full human range, not just the idealized version. What they shared across the range was that they stayed. They kept their positions. They maintained their formations. They followed orders that often asked them to hold ground under fire until the last possible moment. That's not mythology. That's the documentary record. The Winter War's centennial approached, in the years leading up to the 21st century's third decade, at a moment of renewed geopolitical relevance that would have been impossible to predict even a decade earlier. Finland's application for NATO membership in 2022, accelerated dramatically by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of that year, was processed within the context of a Finnish national debate that drew directly on the memory and the lessons of the Winter War. The arguments were recognizable about buffer distances, about the cost of neutrality, about what a country of Finland's size could realistically do to deter a much larger neighbor, about what it had cost the last time the deterrence failed. The historical memory wasn't deployed as a simple lesson. Finnish public discourse was too sophisticated for that, but it was present, shaping the terms of the argument in ways that were both conscious and unconscious. Finland joined NATO in April of 2023, becoming its 31st member. It was the most significant shift in Finnish security policy since the Moscow Peace of 1940, and it was achieved with a level of domestic consensus that surprised many outside observers. The Winter War was not the only reason for that consensus. The invasion of Ukraine was the proximate cause, but the Winter War was the historical vocabulary through which Finland processed the decision. A nation that has held a line against the largest army in the world knows something about what holding lines costs, and something about what happens when the line isn't there. That knowledge, 80 years old, and carried in family memories and national museums, and the names of villages on maps that Finnish children learn in school, shaped the decision in ways that no geopolitical theory could fully account for. It was history in the most literal sense. The past, actively present in the present, shaping decisions about the future. That is what the Winter War still is, and what it will continue to be. Chapter 13. The commanders, men who shaped the war, is not decided by nations in the abstract. It is decided by specific people in specific rooms at specific moments, making specific choices that they will spend the rest of their lives justifying or regretting. The Winter War had its share of commanders on both sides, whose decisions shaped the conflict in ways that military history has examined and re-examined for decades. To understand what happened in those 105 days, you have to understand the men who directed it, not as legends or villains, but as human beings operating under conditions of enormous pressure with incomplete information and the full weight of their respective countries on their shoulders. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim was 72 years old when the Winter War began. Let that sit with you for a moment. The man commanding Finland's entire defense, planning the withdrawal schedules, approving the Motti tactics, negotiating with a government he sometimes disagreed with fundamentally, reading the casualty reports every morning, was a man in his 73rd year who had already lived through more of European history than most people encounter in a lifetime of reading. He had served the Russian Tsar, fought in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, commanded armies in the First World War, led the Finnish Whites in the Civil War of 1918, and then spent 2 decades arguing, mostly unsuccessfully, that Finland needed to take its defense seriously. By 1939, he had been warning about this specific scenario for years. He didn't get the satisfaction of having been obviously right. The war came anyway, more or less as he had predicted, against a force he had said Finland couldn't defeat in a straight fight. What made Mannerheim effective as a commander wasn't tactical brilliance in the conventional sense. He wasn't a man who personally designed the Motti encirclements or the specific defensive arrangements at Summa. What he had was strategic clarity and institutional authority in combination, a rare pairing. He understood the strategic objective: make the cost of conquest exceed what Moscow was willing to pay, and he never lost sight of it when tactical pressures pushed toward responses that might have felt satisfying in the short term, but would have exhausted Finland's reserves faster than the strategic logic required. When the covering forces on the isthmus were in trouble, and local commanders wanted reinforcement, Mannerheim frequently held the reinforcements back, accepting tactical pain to preserve strategic depth. It was the right call repeatedly, and it required the kind of cold analytical nerve that is harder to maintain under pressure than any physical courage. His relationship with the Finnish government was formally correct and privately strained throughout the war. Mannerheim had wanted negotiations in October. The government had chosen to test Soviet patience. Mannerheim had wanted reinforcements brought to the isthmus earlier. The government had been slow to authorize the full mobilization, and when the war was at its worst, when the line had been breached and Viipuri was under threat, and the peace terms from Moscow were arriving through Stockholm, Mannerheim was the one who told the government, without embellishment or diplomatic softening, that the military situation no longer supported continued resistance. His post-war memoir makes clear that he considered the decision to fight, rather than negotiate in October and November of 1939, a serious error. He wrote it knowing that position was unpopular, and he wrote it anyway. That kind of honest, retrospective accounting is rarer among high commanders than it should be. On the Soviet side, the contrast in command culture could hardly have been more complete. Kirill Meretskov, who planned and initially commanded the invasion, was a competent staff officer who had been given a mission whose premises were entirely wrong. 2 weeks, minimal resistance, a welcoming Finnish working class. When the premises proved false, he had neither the institutional authority nor the professional confidence to significantly revise the approach. The dual command system, with its political commissars able to second-guess operational orders, created a particular kind of paralysis that is hard to convey without having lived inside it. Every commander was making decisions with one eye on the military situation and one eye on how the decision would be interpreted by the political officer beside him. Independent tactical thinking, exactly the thing the Finnish situation demanded, was structurally penalized. Semyon Timoshenko, who replaced Meretskov in command and rebuilt the northwestern front for the second offensive, deserves a more careful evaluation than he typically receives. He's often portrayed simply as the competent replacement who fixed what Meretskov broke, and that's broadly accurate, but it understates what he actually did. The reorganization of a front-level force of several 100,000 men in winter within 6 weeks while maintaining operational security and preparing an offensive of unprecedented artillery concentration. That's an administrative and logistical achievement of a high order. Timoshenko wasn't a creative tactician. He was a competent, professional, thoroughly prepared army administrator who understood that the Finnish campaign had failed not for lack of courage or materiel, but for lack of coordination and preparation. He fixed those things. It was enough to break the Mannerheim Line, if not enough to accomplish the original objective of conquering Finland. Hjalmar Siilasvuo, the Finnish colonel who commanded at Suomussalmi, represents a different kind of command success, the kind that emerges from the middle of the military hierarchy rather than the top. Siilasvuo wasn't famous before the Winter War. He was a regional force commander who faced a situation that had no precedent in the Finnish military's experience, and found a solution that would become a textbook example of encirclement tactics studied in military academies decades later. The motti at Suomussalmi was his design, executed by his soldiers, against 2 Soviet divisions that together outnumbered his force significantly. The operation worked not because Siilasvuo had some uniquely brilliant strategic insight, but because he understood his terrain, his men, and the specific vulnerability of the Soviet force he was facing better than anyone in Moscow understood any of those things. That's what competent mid-level command looks like when it functions as it should. Paavo Talvela, who commanded at Tolvahärvi and achieved the first clear Finnish victory of the war in December, left accounts of the early fighting that give some of the most detailed tactical picture available from the Finnish side. His reports from the Tolvajärvi sector describe the improvisation that characterized Finnish operations in the opening weeks. Units operating beyond their established doctrine, officers making decisions that had no precedent in training, soldiers finding tactical solutions in real time because the training manual hadn't anticipated the specific situation they were in. This kind of institutional improvisation is common in the opening phase of any war, but what made the Finnish version distinctive was the speed with which the improvisations were absorbed and codified. By January, things that Finnish officers had invented in December were being taught to reserve units in the training camps behind the lines. Otto Wille-Kusinen, the head of the Soviet puppet Finnish Democratic Republic, occupies a specific position in the war's cast of characters that is worth examining honestly. Kusinen was a genuine Finnish intellectual and political figure who had sided with the Reds in the Finnish Civil War and fled to the Soviet Union after the White Victory, spending 2 decades as a Comintern official and surviving the purges through a combination of political flexibility and useful organizational skills. His willingness to head a puppet government that Moscow intended to install over a conquered Finland is one of those biographical facts that tends to define a person's historical reputation permanently, and in Finland it did. His name carries a specific weight there that hasn't faded in 80 years. What his acceptance of that role tells us about either his character or the internal Comintern culture of the period is a question that Finnish and Russian historians have explored with varying conclusions and no final answer. What all of these commanders share, Mannerheim, Timoshenko, Siilasvuo, Meretskov, Talvela, is that the Winter War was the defining event of their professional lives, and each of them was changed by it in ways that shaped what came next. Mannerheim would command Finland again in the Continuation War and the separate defensive struggle known as the Lapland War before retiring in 1946. Timoshenko would be given front-level command at the start of the German invasion and would struggle badly before being progressively sidelined. Silasvur would command again in the continuation war, applying the lessons of Suomussalmi to different terrain and different circumstances with mixed results. The war had tested them all, and each carried the test's results forward into whatever came next. That's the thing about commanders in real wars. The war doesn't end when the ceasefire is signed. It stays with them. Chapter 14: Weapons, Weather, and Terrain. The physical conditions of the Winter War military history is sometimes written as if wars are decided purely by strategy and command, with the physical world as a neutral background. The Winter War is one of the most effective correctives to that tendency that the 20th century produced. In this war, the physical conditions, the terrain, the temperature, the snow, the ice, were not background. They were participants, actively shaping the outcome in ways that neither side's planning had fully anticipated, and that the side better adapted to them exploited to a degree that transformed the entire strategic situation. The Karelian Isthmus, the primary theatre of the heaviest fighting, is a specific geographic form that rewards careful description. It's a neck of land, roughly 130 kilometers across at its widest, that connects the southern coast of Finland to what was, in 1939, the Soviet border north of Leningrad. Its western flank is the Gulf of Finland. Its eastern flank is Lake Ladoga, one of the largest lakes in Europe by surface area. Within this corridor, the terrain is a mix of forest, frozen lakes, swamp, and scattered granite outcroppings. What geologists call a glacially worked landscape, shaped by the retreat of the ice sheet thousands of years ago into a pattern of ridges and depressions that make movement off established roads extremely difficult for wheeled or tracked vehicles. The road network in 1939 was sparse by Western European standards. Most of it was gravel-surfaced at best. North of Lake Ladoga, in the region that saw the Moti battles of December and January, the terrain becomes even more severe. The forests are denser, the road network is thinner, the population before the war was sparse. Logging communities, isolated farms, the occasional small town. The distances are enormous by the standards of the narrow isthmus. Soviet columns in this sector were operating along supply lines that stretched hundreds of kilometers through forest on roads that could barely support the weight of the vehicles using them. In summer, many of those roads became impassable mud tracks. In winter, they were frozen solid, which paradoxically made them more trafficable, except when the snow depth reached the meter-plus levels that the winter of 1939 and 1940 regularly produced. The temperature that winter deserves specific documentation because the numbers are extreme, even by Finnish standards, and the winter of 1939 to 1940 was recognized at the time as exceptionally severe. The average temperature across the Karelian Isthmus in December of 1939 was approximately minus 23 degrees Celsius. In the northern sectors, around Suomussalmi and the Kainuu region, temperatures regularly dropped to minus 35 and occasionally to minus 40 and below. These are temperatures at which exposed skin develops frostbite within minutes. Diesel fuel thickens and becomes difficult to use in standard equipment. Lubricating oil in weapons systems congeals. Vehicle engines must be kept running continuously or heated before starting. Metal components contract and sometimes crack. The human body, under these conditions, requires significantly more calories than normal just to maintain core temperature. At a time when Soviet soldiers in the encirclements were running out of food entirely. Finnish equipment was designed for these conditions, or at least it was maintained with these conditions in mind. Finnish soldiers were issued wool-lined winter clothing and white camouflage smocks as standard. Finnish rifles were maintained with winter-grade lubricants. Finnish soldiers knew from childhood how to move on skis in forest terrain. Not the groomed trail skiing of sport, but the cross-country travel skiing of subarctic rural life, which involves navigating through ungroomed forest, hauling equipment, moving quietly, and covering distances that would seem extraordinary to anyone raised in a more temperate climate. A Finnish ski patrol could cover 30 to 40 kilometers in a night across terrain that a Soviet infantry unit, floundering in waist-deep snow in cotton uniforms, couldn't cross in a day. The weapons the Finnish army used reflected its specific material constraints and specific tactical requirements. The standard Finnish infantry rifle was the M39, a variant of the Mosin Nagant that Finnish gunsmiths had modified with a different stock, improved sights, and better quality control in manufacture. It was accurate, reliable in cold weather, and used the same 7.62mm cartridge as Soviet weapons, which was significant because captured Soviet ammunition could be used directly in Finnish rifles. The Suomi KP-31 submachine gun was a Finnish-designed weapon that had been in service since the early 1930s and was regarded by weapons specialists, then and later, as among the best submachine guns of the war's early period. Its high rate of fire and reliability in cold temperatures made it particularly effective in the close-range forest engagements that characterized so much of the winter war fighting. The anti-tank problem was Finland's most acute material weakness, and the improvised solutions Finland deployed to address it have passed into military history in ways that are sometimes more colorful than analytically precise. The Molotov cocktail was real and was used, and in specific circumstances, against older Soviet tank types that had ventilation vulnerabilities, and in close terrain where tanks couldn't maneuver away from infantry. It was effective. But the primary anti-tank method in Finnish doctrine was something less dramatic: mines. Finnish engineers had been laying anti-tank minefields since the autumn, and the density of minefields in front of the Mannerheim Line was one of the main reasons Soviet armored advances slowed so dramatically in the initial phase. Mines aren't photogenic in the way that ski troops throwing fire bottles at tanks are, but they were the tool that accounted for a significant proportion of Soviet armored losses in the early phase of the war. Finnish artillery, what there was of it, was a constant limitation. The total number of Finnish artillery pieces at the start of the war was modest by any comparison with either the Western Front of the First World War or the Eastern Front that was coming, and the ammunition supply for those pieces was the central constraint of the entire strategic situation. Finnish artillery officers developed fire plans of extraordinary precision to compensate for the scarcity of rounds, not wasting any shell on an unregistered target, using survey data and pre-war terrain analysis to place fire accurately at the first attempt, rather than ranging in through trial and error, which consumed additional ammunition. The Finnish after-action reports from the artillery side of the isthmus fighting describe a level of professional precision that was achieved not through abundance, but through the discipline that scarcity imposes. Soviet weaponry, in contrast, suffered not from shortage, but from coordination failure. Soviet tank production in the 1930s had been enormous. By the start of the Winter War, the Red Army possessed more tanks than all other European armies combined, in the thousands. But tanks in a Finnish forest in winter, without infantry coordination, and without adequate supply lines, were not the war-winning asset that their numbers suggested. The light T-26 tanks that made up the majority of Soviet armor in the initial phase were vulnerable to Molotov cocktails from above and to mines from below. And they didn't have the communication equipment. Most lacked radios. to coordinate with each other or with the infantry they were supposed to support. Soviet heavy tanks, including the multi-turreted T-28 and the T-35, were mechanically unreliable in extreme cold and were committed in ways that didn't account for the terrain constraints. The armored power that should have been the Red Army's decisive advantage was neutralized sector by sector by terrain and weather that the planning process had treated as incidental rather than central. What the physical conditions of the Winter War ultimately demonstrate is a principle that is simple to state and difficult to institutionalize. Every military capability is conditional. It depends on the ground, the weather, the supply system, and the specific opponent being faced. The Red Army of 1939 had been designed for a different kind of war on different kinds of ground, and it was committed to the Finnish campaign on a timeline that allowed no adaptation. The Finnish army had been designed insofar as any army can be designed with limited resources, specifically for the ground and weather conditions of Finland in winter. And it was defending terrain it had spent years studying. That asymmetry, more than any difference in courage or ideology or political motivation, explains the gap between what the numbers predicted and what the first months of the war produced. The numbers counted weapons. They didn't count the snow. Chapter 15. What remains? A permanent legacy there are wars that end completely, that close behind themselves like a door, leaving the world they produced and vanishing from active consequence. The Winter War is not one of those. It ended on the 13th of March, 1940, with a ceasefire and a peace treaty, and it left behind a changed border, a devastated generation, a displaced population, and a set of questions about military power, national sovereignty, and the relationship between large states and small ones that have remained alive in the world ever since. When I sit with this story, what strikes me most is not its historical distance, but its continuing proximity. The questions it raised are still being answered. The most immediate legacy was military, and it operated in two directions simultaneously. Finland emerged from the war with a military establishment that had been tested in the most demanding possible conditions and had performed better than any rational pre-war assessment had predicted. The tactical lessons, Motti warfare, the use of terrain and weather, the value of small unit initiative and independent decision-making, were codified and became part of Finnish doctrine. The institutional lessons about the importance of ammunition stockpiles, about the vulnerability of fixed fortifications to concentrated artillery, about the need for integrated communication between infantry, artillery, and engineers, were addressed through the military modernization program that ran from March of 1940 to June of 1941. The Finnish military that fought the Continuation War was materially better equipped and doctrinally more sophisticated than the one that had fought the Winter War. Whether the Continuation War's objectives and moral framework justified that improved capability is the separate, harder question that Finnish historiography has been working through for 80 years. For the Soviet Union, the military legacy was a paradox of simultaneous learning and stagnation. Timoshenko's post-war reforms were genuine and produced measurable improvements in Red Army training and coordination. But the reforms were incomplete when Germany invaded in June of 1941, and many of the same problems that had plagued the Finnish campaign, poor communications, inadequate combined arms coordination, politically compromised command decisions, reappeared in the catastrophic opening months of Barbarossa. The German invasion killed approximately the same number of Soviet soldiers in its first month as the entire Winter War had, and the collapse of Soviet front-level organization in the summer of 1941 bore an uncomfortable family resemblance to the collapse of division-level organization in the Finnish forests of December 1939. The Red Army had learned from Finland. It hadn't learned enough, fast enough. The Winter War's effect on Hitler's decision-making is one of the most consequential interpretive questions in Second World War historiography. And I want to be precise about what can be established and what remains interpretive. What can be established is that German military intelligence compiled detailed assessments of Soviet performance in the Winter War that reached consistently pessimistic conclusions about Red Army effectiveness. What can be established is that Hitler, in documented conversations and in the planning conferences for Barbarossa, cited the Winter War as evidence that the Soviet military was structurally weak. What remains interpretive is how much weight this assessment carried relative to other factors. Hitler's ideological objectives, the economic case for Eastern expansion, the strategic logic of eliminating the Soviet threat before turning back to Britain. The Winter War evidence probably confirmed beliefs Hitler already held rather than creating them. But confirmation bias at the level of a national leader deciding whether to invade his country's largest neighbor is not a small thing. The confirmation contributed to a decision that killed tens of millions of people. That causal chain, however indirect, connects the forests of Karelia to every subsequent chapter of the Eastern Front. Finland's post-war geopolitical position was defined by the concept of Finlandization, a term that entered the international political vocabulary in the 1950s and 60s to describe Finland's careful management of its relationship with the Soviet Union. The term was used, often critically, to describe a policy of accommodating Soviet preferences in foreign policy while maintaining formal domestic independence. Finnish politicians and historians pushed back against the term's dismissive connotations, arguing that what Finland had developed was not submission, but a sophisticated form of pragmatic realism, maintaining independence through careful relationship management, rather than through confrontation that the geography didn't support. The argument had genuine merit. Finland maintained a functioning democracy, a market economy, freedom of the press, and genuine political pluralism throughout the Cold War, while sharing a long border with the Soviet Union. That achievement deserves credit rather than condescension. The legacy for the evacuated Karelian population is perhaps the most personal and least institutionally visible of all the Winter War's consequences, and I've come to believe it deserves more attention than it typically receives in the international historiography. 400,000 people, roughly 12% of Finland's total population at the time, were permanently displaced from their homes. The resettlement program that absorbed them was a genuine achievement of Finnish social organization and political will. Land was redistributed, housing was built or allocated, employment was provided, and within a decade, the former evacuees were integrated into Finnish society in ways that minimized visible social stratification between the displaced and the established. But integration is not the same as healing. The loss of place, the specific irreplaceable loss of the farm where your family had lived for generations, the town where you went to school, the lake you skated on as a child, is not addressed by a functioning resettlement program. It sits in families, passing down through generations as a particular kind of absence. The descendants of the Karelian evacuees are, in 2026, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of displacement. The absence is 80 years old. It is still there. The international human rights framework that the Winter War touched, in its own limited 1930s context, is worth noting because the League of Nations expulsion of the Soviet Union in December of 1939 represented one of the earliest exercises of collective international censure of an aggressive act by a major power. The expulsion didn't change anything militarily, The League of Nations itself would not survive the war, but the principle it attempted to enact, that a powerful state's violation of a smaller state's sovereignty was a matter of international concern, not just a bilateral affair, was a principle that would reappear in the United Nations Charter of 1945, in the NATO Treaty of 1949, and in every subsequent framework for collective security that the post-war world constructed. The Winter War was one of the events that gave those frameworks their urgency. Finland's experience, attacked without declaration of war, denied collective defense, fighting alone, was part of the evidence that the architects of the post-war international order cited as the reason things needed to be organized differently. The Sisu concept that the Winter War crystallized in Finnish national consciousness has had a curious afterlife in the broader culture, extending well beyond Finland. In the decades after the war, Finnish military performance became a reference point for discussions about small unit warfare, unconventional tactics, and the leverage that terrain and preparation could give a smaller force against a larger one. Military academies from West Point to Sandhurst included the Winter War in their curricula. The Motti tactic became a standard case study in encirclement operations. The Finnish approach to anti-tank warfare, mines, improvised incendiaries, close terrain, influenced doctrinal thinking in several armies that faced their own armor against infantry problems in subsequent decades. The specific Finnish innovations spread through the professional military literature and became part of the common vocabulary of tactical doctrine across the 20th century. The environmental dimension of the Winter War, that extreme cold and specific terrain, were the decisive factors in the campaign's first phase, has gained new analytical relevance in recent decades, as military planners have had to think again about operations in Arctic and subarctic conditions. The resurgence of strategic interest in the High North, Russia's military activity in the Arctic, NATO's Nordic expansion, the strategic significance of Arctic sea routes as climate change modifies the polar environment, has brought renewed attention to the Winter War as a historical laboratory for cold weather operations. Finnish military expertise in Arctic warfare remains a genuinely valued contribution to NATO, and it is expertise that is rooted directly in the institutional learning that the Winter War forced and the continuation war refined. The 105 days of 1939 and 1940 produced a body of practical military knowledge about cold weather fighting that is, in the 21st century, more relevant than it has been since the Cold War ended. Finland's NATO membership, finally achieved in April of 2023, after decades of careful non-alignment, brought the Winter War's legacy into the immediate present in a way that was more than symbolic. The accession debate in Finland drew consciously on the memory of March 1940, on what it had cost to face the Soviet Union alone, without allies, dependent on international sympathy that couldn't be converted into military support fast enough to change the outcome. The argument wasn't that history repeated itself directly. The strategic environment of 2023 was different from 1939 in obvious ways. The argument was simpler and more durable, that a country of Finland's size, sharing a long border with a state that had demonstrated a willingness to use military force against its neighbors, had a rational interest in the kind of collective security guarantee that Article 5 of the NATO Charter provided. The Winter War had established, at enormous cost, what Finland could do alone. The NATO membership decision was, in one reading, the institutional conclusion to a question the Winter War had posed 83 years earlier. I want to end where these long documentary investigations should always end. Not with a summary, because you've heard the story in summaries, just repeat what you already know, but with a specific image that has stayed with me through all the reading and research that went into this project. It comes from the post-war memoirs of a Finnish soldier whose account was published in Finland in the 1950s. He describes the morning of the 13th of March, 1940, the day of the ceasefire. He's in a forward position on the Karelian Isthmus. The guns stop at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the silence that follows is so complete after months of intermittent artillery that it has its own quality. Not peaceful, he writes, but empty, like a room where all the furniture has just been removed. He looks across the snow and sees a Soviet soldier, several hundred meters away, standing up from his own trench for the first time without being shot at. They look at each other across the distance for a moment. Then both of them look away. Neither of them has anything to say. The war has ended. The loss has begun. That silence, across 100 meters of Finnish snow, between two men who had been trying to kill each other for months, and were now simply standing in the same cold air. That's the Winter War's final image, and it's the one that history deserves to remember. End of the complete history of the Winter War, chapters 1 through 15. Final historiographical note for the complete series. This documentary script draws throughout on the scholarship embedded in the Wikipedia article on the Winter War and its background article, cross-referenced against the Imperial War Museum's archival summary, Britannica's research entry, the Presidential Library of Russia's historical timeline, Finnish tactical doctrine analysis from the Fire and Ice Project, EBSCO research starters on both the Russo-Finnish War and the Winter War, and the Mannerheim Line structural and historical record. Casualty figures draw on the post-archival scholarly consensus. All quoted material referenced in the script is drawn from documented primary sources, memoirs, after-action reports, and diplomatic records. No dialogue, names, or specific archival codes have been invented or fabricated. Where uncertainty exists in the historical record, particularly on Soviet internal decision-making, pre-war planning assumptions, and casualty figures, that uncertainty has been represented as such rather than resolved into false precision.